The next speaker is unfortunately couldn't make it here today. It's Johan Ordish from the MHRA, and Johan leads the software group at the MHRA, and particularly on looking at how, when medical devices require regulatory input and so on. So pharmacogenomics and software as a medical device is what Johan is going to talk to us about. So I hope Johan is online. Great.
Brilliant. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry I can't be with you there in person. Temptingly, I can see a tiny sliver of the view outside the building, and it looks absolutely incredible. So I'm so sorry I can't be there. But thank you so much for the opportunity. So I'm Johan, Head of Software and AI at the MHRA. Regulates software as a medical device in most of its forms. I thought I'd just start off by actually just reflecting on the 4 I's that Munir started with, because he is absolutely and completely correct. And I think from a safety perspective, I thought I'd just quickly run through them and just point out the safety implications as well. So if a device isn't intelligent, then it's not usable. If a device isn't usable, then it cannot be safe. If a device is not interoperable, then it can't meet its intended use in those systems for which it's not interoperable for. If a device isn't integrated into decision-making, then its intended purpose will not be clear. And having a clear intended purpose is key to demonstrating a safe, effective device. And finally, if that device is not inclusive, then that performance may vary across those subpopulations. So the 4 I's to me have an incredible and core link to the safety of those devices. It's safety, 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 safety. So with that going on, hopefully a smooth link into what I'm going to talk about. So pharmacogenetics, clinical decision support tools, and software as a medical device. That is the alphabet soup you currently see before you. So I'm a civil servant. Here is my civil servant slide. I'm not going to be disclosing some extra policy for you today. It's going to be views and some interpretations, some of which are my own. So context, where are we? So software as a medical device more broadly, where do clinical decision support tools fit? Where do pharmacogenomics tools that use software fit? We have an incredible amount of breadth of applications for software as a medical device at the moment, all the way from screening, imaging, stratification, triaging, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, and management of chronic conditions. We see a huge array of devices, but also those huge array of devices often come with a breadth of complexity as well. Some of them are relatively simple clinical calculators, or say weight-based medication calculators, all the way through to devices with multiple layers of AI. So I think the kind of record now, I've seen 5 different layers of AI all in the one single device. But there's also a breadth of experience as well. We see big pharma going digital, but also we see the digital sector coming into the healthcare sector. Both bring some unique challenges, but also some unique opportunities. And the way that these devices will qualify as a medical device will also change. Some of them are meant to be standalone devices. Some of them are components in a wider piece of hardware, some accessories, systems. Some are IVD software, especially relevant for pharmacogenomics. Some are part of an IVD kit, and some are companion diagnostics, again, very relevant for pharmacogenetics. So we have a changing legislative landscape in the UK. So in Great Britain, we have the 3 directives, and they are codified into the Medical Device Regulations 2002. And we've just announced that it will be extending standstill, so there's a year's break for things to remain the same. And then we've also announced transitional arrangements where CE marking under the directives gets an extra 3 years to transition. And if you're under the EU MDR and IVDR, you get an extra 5. But we also have this Medicines and Medical Devices Act 2021 that gives us the power to reform the Medical Device Regulations 2002. And we set our intentions to do exactly that in the government response released in June of this year. So we intend to change things. But the situation is slightly different in Northern Ireland. EU regulations apply there, and the MHRA is the competent authority for Northern Ireland for those regulations, the MDR and the IVDR. So the government response, I just mentioned that. There is actually a particular chapter on software which demonstrates what we intend to do for software as a medical device, including IVD software. And there's a wider change program to basically support that with guidance, because we're not making a lot of changes for our legislation for software. We think it's best to do it in guidance to make sure it's flexible, to make sure it can meet industry needs. So here's a flavor of some of those things that we do plan to change for software. So we plan to actually just give an explicit definition of software that has been around for some time. We plan to follow International Medical Device Regulator Forum classification rules to be internationally harmonized. And there's a few extra things that you can see there, predetermined change control plans being the only one I'll highlight here, to give manufacturers the freedom to change their algorithm in the post-market phase to ensure performance maintains across time, but that can be done in a controlled, predictable, and safe way. And here we have the 11 work packages that we intend to bring forward that wider suite of guidance and processes. So you can see there on the left, the software work streams 1 to 8 there broadly follow the life cycle of a device. So we intend to, again, clarify what qualifies as a device in software as a medical device, how it's classified, clarify the pre-market requirements, the post-market requirements, ensure that they are cyber secure as well, so they're secure from intrusion, and then some extra work packages there, and then 3 work packages on AI to get AI as a medical device right as well. I'll be primarily hitting upon work package 1 and 2 there and how they relate with pharmacogenetics and clinical decision support tools today. So qualification, what qualifies as software as a medical device in this realm? Well, here is kind of setting out the AI component. So I think there are 4 key faces of AI for medicines currently out there. So there's AI for knowledge discovery. That is, you're using AI to find novel drug targets. You're trying to repurpose existing medicines that are already on your catalog, for example. Sometimes you're using AI for clinical trials, for example. So you're using it to find the right patient for the right trial, using to stratify the population. Sometimes you're using AI as a part of the product package. So that's where pharmacogenomics often sits. So you're trying to target the right drug for the right patient at the right time. And sometimes you're using AI for pharmacovigilance to see where things go wrong. How does this fit with software as a medical device? Well, broadly, if you're at either end of the scale, the knowledge discovery or pharmacovigilance, that will generally not qualify as software as a medical device, not qualify as an IVD. It depends how you use it, of course, and that is a rule of thumb. But if you're in the middle, if you're using it for patient stratification, and if you're using it as part of the product package, for instance, pharmacogenetics and a clinical decision support tool, if you're looking to impact the care of that patient, that will often qualify as a medical device or an IVD, especially where that will influence patient care. So that's kind of where we're talking about today. That's where we're orientated today. So here's the boring stuff. Software as medical device classification. So there is a definition of software. You can see it there, a set of instructions that processes input data and creates output data. Pretty basic and very wide definition. So really what matters here is what is a medical purpose. And that medical purpose is defined in law. You can see in green there, that's the medical device directive. So if it's around the prevention of disease, diagnosis of disease, monitoring of disease, treatment or alleviation of disease, compensation for an injury or handicap, we are updating that last word there, handicap, by the way, because it is severely outdated, but currently still, unfortunately, in our law, or the investigation, replacement, or modification of a physiological process or control of conception. You can see the IVD definition as well there concerning a physiological or pathological state, concerning I'm going to stop reading those out because you can read them yourself, and I'm tripping over my words, but you can see there. So software as a medical device is simply software that has a medical purpose. How do we define that intended purpose? How does the MHRA understand what the intended purpose of a device is? Well, that is taken from a lot of evidence, basically, the claims made by the manufacturer. Those claims can be found, for example, in the labeling and the instructions for use and promotional materials. And that intended purpose is construed objectively. So we look at the standpoint of the reasonably informed consumer. We look objectively to that intended purpose to see whether it qualifies as a medical device. So it's going to be increasingly important as well that you not just understand, am I a medical device or an IVD, but you understand which one of those you are. Am I a medical device or am I an IVD? The MHRA have been getting an increasing amount of really complex questions, primarily around polygenic risk scores, because the SNP can drive PRS, but also other factors, for instance, age or gender can drive those scores. And that can really determine whether you're a medical device or an IVD, and so the kind of evidence you have to generate to come to market and to stay on the market. So we revised our little classification system there, it looks quite complicated, but it's designed basically to give people that can have an easy answer to whether they're an IVD medical device or whether a medical device, the quickest decision possible. and it tries to hold back the most complex decisions to only those for which it's really quite necessary. So the most complex decision, what it usually comes down to, is the output substantially driven by data from a human specimen, or is it not? If it's driven by data from a human specimen let me start again. If it's driven by data from a human specimen, then it's probably an IVD. For instance, a SNP would count as that. So that's how you determine whether software is a medical device or an IVD. So internationally, it's also fairly complex in the realm of clinical decision support tools and software. So the TGA, for example, in Australia, they have a carve out for a lot of clinical decision support tools. So a lot of clinical decision support tools that would qualify as a medical device in the UK don't in Australia. That used to be similar in the US until very, very recently. I'm talking about a couple of weeks ago, where the US FDA clarified that a lot of clinical decision support tools that were previously excluded are now included. So a lot of the tools that you'll find, for instance, you're talking about today, tools already in Epic, for example, are now covered by the FDA or previously were, and they have now clarified that position. So that's good news for the harmonization, because our regulations are starting to cohere and they're starting to become more internationally harmonized. So classification, what does classification look like? I'm really pleased that previous speakers today have already hit upon some of the risks that software can present, but also some of its benefits. So let's look at some of the risks that software can pose over and above a regular medical device or IVD. So first, they can be deployed at scale and at pace, so they can spread very, very fast. That's a benefit because you can treat more patients, you can get them in the hands of patients or clinicians faster, but if they don't work, that's also a risk. Number two, they're dynamic. You can change and update them. You don't have to recall them, but you can update that model over time. Again, that's a huge benefit because you can improve the performance across time, but it's also a risk because that retraining, for example, or that update can introduce a bug, for example. Some models are non-linear as well. So that means a small change in the model can cause a large change in performance. Again, that's a benefit, but also a risk to be covered off. The longer the lines of code you have in your model or in your software, the probability that you have a bug included starts to reach 1, the longer those lines of codes get. So again, that is a risk that we need to be aware of. And also cybersecurity. So network devices allow us to transfer patient information faster and better than we did before, but it also introduces a novel risk plane, the risk of intrusion, the risk of malicious attack. But also one of the key safety items here is computer-human interaction. We know that humans interact with computers differently than they do versus other humans. So automation bias, alert fatigue, for example, are different when it comes to a computer versus a human. So that's important to cover off from a safety aspect, the usability of the device as well. So rule of thumb for classification. If it's IVD software, you use IVD classification rules. If it's a general medical device, well then in the future regs, we will follow the IMDRF classification rules. That's under the new regulations. So what does that mean? So software classification under the IVDR and under the current directives and also the EU MDR, if you're class 1, that means you're self-assured. You do not have to go through a conformity assessment body, the CAP system. If you're 2A and above, then you must go through that system. In the IVDR, if you're class A, and as long as that's a non-sterile device, for example, then you do not have to go through that system. You can be self-assured, but if you're class B, C, or D, then you have to go through that system. That can add extra time and expense, but that is how the system currently works. So how do you make that determination? Well, currently for software as a medical device, general medical devices, that comes down to Rule 10 under the directives. So the tipping point is whether they allow for direct diagnosis or not. And this rule is consistently misinterpreted in different places. So it comes down to this, really. A device is to be considered to allow for direct diagnosis when it provides a diagnosis of the disease condition by itself, or it provides decisive information for making a diagnosis, or claims are made that it can perform or support the function of a clinician in performing a diagnostic task. Again, you can probably see the very, very obvious links to pharmacogenetics here and clinical decision support tools. How are things shaping up internationally, though, as well? So the IMDRF has a classification rule. MHRA have signaled that we will be following that classification rule when we update our regulations where you have a general medical device. So you can see there the kind of matrix of decision making there. So on the left side, that it concerns a state of healthcare situation or condition, so non-serious, serious, and critical. And then on the other side, you have the significance of the information provided by that device to the healthcare decision: inform, drive, treat, and diagnose. And there are clarifications about how you interpret those different statements as you go through. The EU MDR that currently applies in Northern Ireland has Rule 11, which tries to mimic that IMDRF classification procedure as well. So you can see that rule there. So finally, some tips for you, some tips for pharmacogenomics and clinical decision support tools and software as a medical device. So if you have a pharmacogenetics tool, that is probably going to be a companion diagnostic. That's really important, especially if you're in the EU, because there are separate rules for companion diagnostics and how you work with the EMA, for example. You should ask yourself, what drives the model? So is the output derived from a human specimen, for example? If you have pharmacogenomics, you're likely to have SNPs in there, for example, somewhere. So that means, you at least have an IVD component in there. So the question is, does that IVD component drive the device? How is that output derived? If it's polygenic risk scores, for example, it will probably come down to what substantially drives that model. You should also consider how that clinical decision support tool and the pharmacogenomics software qualify as a medical device, how they integrated into EMIS, for example, how they integrated into the healthcare electronic record, how do they interface with that system, and what claims are you making about it? That can be really, really important when it comes to the success of getting that device to market. You should have a concrete intended purpose as soon as possible in the life cycle. So it's not enough to say that we're giving information to a clinician. You should have a concrete understanding about what clinicians are supposed to do with that information. Is it a diagnosis? Is it an adjunctive tool, for example? You should tell us exactly in the most granular detail possible what the intended purpose is. If you're building software, you should build it according to a quality management system with proper documentation. You cannot believe the amount of manufacturers I have come across where they have built a tool not according to quality management systems, and they have to go back and spend millions of pounds redoing the same process over again. It is really important that if you're building a tool that can qualify as a medical device, design it according to a quality management system that will save you money down the track. Let your intended purpose guide your literature review, and then let your literature review guide the clinical evidence and performance evaluation generation that you then subsequently do. So start with your intended purpose. What is it that you're doing? Start with its value proposition and what it's supposed to do. Then do a literature review, and then generate the evidence based off the gaps you've identified in that literature review. That is the best way to make sure you don't waste money and you get exactly where you need to be going as fast as you can. And finally, you need to plan for change as well. Software as a medical device, when it comes to market, often bears no resemblance to that which is on the market years later. You need to plan for that change. You need to consider, when will you retrain your model, for example? What are the standard of care changes? Will you change the boundaries, for example? How will you update the SNPs, for example, in your library? All of that you should consider ahead of time, because if you don't, and you don't plan, then failing to plan to change is planning to fail, more or less. So finally, that is where I shall end. But the broad view for software as a medical device is that it has huge opportunities. Pharmacogenetics and clinical decision support tools have huge opportunities to help patients. Our job is always just to make sure they don't hinder. So hopefully you will come on that journey with us. And Munir, I'm very happy to take questions if there's time. I can't quite hear questions from the floor, so you might have to repeat them into the microphone if that's okay. Really sorry about that.
So Johan, it's quite a lot to take in terms of our regulation, in 20 minutes or so. So I'm sure people have some questions for clarification. Can I start off with one, if that's okay? Timelines, in terms of when somebody puts in an application to when the MHRA or the notified body, etc., has to be able to provide a decision. What are the timelines you operate toward?
So it depends on the class of device. So class 1 devices are self-assured. So basically the manufacturer can move as fast as they can move to sign that legal document to say they meet those requirements. Approved body queues are currently quite long. So the advice is, as soon as you have a solid technical file, as soon as you can start that process, you should definitely get in that queue. We are working as hard as possible to get capacity in that system to ensure that queue is shortened and to ensure manufacturers can have a speedy decision. But currently that is really contingent on capacity, and that capacity changes day to day, month to month, which we're looking to improve. So Munir, I don't have a particular kind of date, time or month or so on, but we're looking to shorten that as fast as possible. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, great. Any questions from the floor? If there are no other questions, maybe I can ask another question. Sorry, is there a question? Yes, please, yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me. My name is Erna Munoz. I come from Germany, and my question is about the FDA, their regulation about decision support systems, which you refer to it. How is it going to affect worldwide area? Because up to now, FDA accepting very well what is according to MDR certified. Is that going to change there? What is the impact there is? It is a very new regulation, or their regulation, they call it. What is the impact on PGX? Thank you.
So I don't predict many worldwide changes off the base of that new clinical decision support guidance from the FDA, primarily because it actually brings their regulation even closer into line with the IMDRF rules. So I think this is actually all very good news. It's basically bringing international harmonization even closer as a dream. So I don't impact that the international sphere will move to the FDA, because the FDA is moving to the international sphere, if that makes sense. I hope that's helpful.
So Johan, the question I had was that obviously there are many people trying to develop software systems like this, AI-based, PRSs are coming through, etc. Do you think there's enough expertise within the regulatory agencies, within notified bodies, etc., to be able to cope with the deluge of applications you're going to get?
Well, Munir, if that's an offer, we'd greatly receive an application from you to join us, of course, and you already are. But no, we could always use more expertise, right? So we accept that, but we are bringing in expertise from across different sectors as well, so academia, industry, and so on, to assist us. We can always use more of it. The approved bodies, as a part of the assessment to be an approved body, you have to prove that you have the expertise and the capacity underneath the codes for which you apply to be an approved body with. So that will include software as a medical device and AI as a medical device. So the approved bodies should all have that expertise in-house and sufficient amounts of it to cope. Otherwise, they would be violating those commitments. So look, we could always use more of it. I'm sure the approved bodies would say the exact same thing. Medical device regulation is kind of it's a hot topic at the moment, and trying to get people employed in the sector. To be frank, you have to pay them a lot of money, so it's difficult to compete with different parts of industry, and we can always use further. But also the state of the art, for instance, for AI as medical device is not yet settled. We're trying to settle that worldwide, and that requires deep technical expertise, which we are getting from across the sector. Munir, I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Oh, so we've got two more questions, two short questions, two short answers. So one over here, first of all, Jackie, and then Carl.
Yeah, very briefly, Jackie O'Brien from Inagene. We actually have a software medical device that's an IVDR. And we've gone through your process once already, just checking the regulations are changing next year. How are you anticipating dealing with the backlog and the workflows with the notifiable bodies and everything coming through as everything gets reviewed and updated?
Yeah, so a couple of mitigation factors there. So we do recognise it's a problem. So number one, getting more capacity in the system. There is no replacement just for getting more approved bodies on the ground and more bums on seats. Number two, being sensible about how we use that approved body time as well. So trying to streamline the process wherever possible. Number three, there is a possibility of what's called a delta assessment. So our regulations should not be 1,000 miles away from what the EU MDR and IVDR are. So if you're a manufacturer applying, there is a possibility to apply for what's called a delta assessment. So if you're going for EU MDR and IVDR, you can basically add on the UKCA mark and they can do a delta assessment because those regulations should be relatively close. So Yeah, so getting more capacity in the system, being more sensible at how we use approved bodies, and being flexible, that will hopefully go some way to clear that backlog. And we are definitely working on it. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, Carl, last question.
Johan, Carl Pringle from Genexus. My question is there a difference in the certification process depending on whether AI is used or sort of classic algorithms?
So not currently, but you'll be meeting different state-of-the-art as well. So MHRA jointly with FDA and Health Canada last year published good machine learning practice principles for medical device development. So that's a set of principles which we think are core to getting AI right. So having a look at those principles and ensuring you're consistent will be good. But essentially, our view for AI is that the current essential requirements are fit for purpose. We don't need to have new ones for AI. In fact, they're already covered by the very broad essential requirements. What's required is an interpretation about how to apply those for AI. So that will be the important thing. And that's what we're going to focus on from the MHRA perspective, is producing guidance, for instance, about what state-of-the-art means for AI as a medical device, what it means to demonstrate safety under normal conditions of use for AI as a medical device. That should give market certainty about how to meet those requirements in that context. So not a different certification process, but there are different considerations and how you interpret the essential requirements and generate clinical evidence. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you very much, Johan. That's great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.